On his way home from school one night, a 16-year-old boy named Kevin decided to casually browse a local yard sale and was soon drawn to an extraordinarily ugly black Russian sculpture with a head mounted on a pedestal. He thought its grotesque appearance was cool, so he bought it for $1, took it home, and put it in his room without his parents ever seeing it. At first, it was nothing more than an intriguing object, but soon it began to emit a strange presence that quickly filled the entire room and captured Kevin's desire to investigate occult matters. He had never before been interested in the possible existence of magic and how spells worked, but he now seemed to have become somewhat obsessed. He researched all kinds of spell casting topics on the internet and went out to buy books on magic and occult tools. There was a small table in his room, and he decided to turn it into a makeshift altar by placing the resin head in the middle. Now it was time for Kevin to work on the magical witchcraft he had already researched. At first, nothing happened, making Kevin momentarily conclude that magic must be a bunch of bull, but curiosity made him continue, and soon he was attempting much more complex rituals, such as those used to summon spirits. As he delved deeper into the occult, he seemed to become more reclusive, locking his bedroom door and keeping much more to himself, never discussing what he was doing in the now mysterious bedroom. He used to be a model teenager, happily employed and excellent at school. His parents trusted him, so they gave him his own private space, but they weren't allowed in his bedroom for months. Although Kevin was compelled to study the occult and possibly practice witchcraft through supernatural means, he apparently hadn't spontaneously received the power to control the forces he was now playing with. It soon dawned on him that his summoning attempts had succeeded, and that the resin head statue now had a spirit in it. There wasn't a big show or an obvious manifestation of the entity, but Kevin knew there was a sudden presence in the head that hadn't been there before. This new presence didn't seem to want to go away, and Kevin was filled with the need to paint the head to better match what he perceived the spirit to look like, outlining its eyes with sharp red paint. Kevin was very inexperienced in dealing with spirits, and so unsurprisingly, he soon found himself in some serious trouble. Although he summoned the spirit in question, it was obvious that the spirit was now in control. Thick black shadows appeared around his bedroom, haunting him through the night. Now he could always hear and feel the growling presence of the being subconsciously. It watched him through the hideous statue while he was in his room, and its invisible gaze followed him everywhere he went, stalking him at school and work, desperately going through his occult books to figure out how he could get rid of the haunting being. Kevin learned that in order to regain control, he must acquire the name of the malevolent spirit. However, when he demanded to know the name of his demonic attacker, he heard nothing but unspoken gibberish. The phonetic spelling of the gibberish returned no results from various demonic and spiritual dictionaries. Sometimes the spirit didn't even bother to respond, but simply said, "You know who I am," and cackling maniacally. Soon the fierce ring of this enigmatic entity progressed to a more terrifying stage. It was now seemingly in control of Kevin's thoughts and speech. The whispering of the ghost soon became darker and fiercer. It kept telling him how worthless he was and how no one cared about him, telling him to cease his existence. It told him to jump from the roof and walk into traffic. You deserve to pass, so pass now. Unsurprisingly, Kevin soon fell into deep depression, abandoning his magical rituals and still unable to defeat the terrifying spirit. He did his best to drive the creature away, but these rituals only seemed to make it stronger and angrier. Feeling that he couldn't take it anymore, he finally found himself racing down the stairs and rushing into the living room to tell his parents, Tom and Christine. They were watching TV, and Kevin hysterically announced that he thought he had brought something in, and now it was trying to take his life. His parents were too shocked to speak at first, but then the room fell silent at Kevin's desperate sobs. Presumably, parental instinct kicked in. Tom and Christine jumped up, and their son led them upstairs, showing them the occult den that had once been his bedroom. The curtains were drawn, and a black sheet draped over all surfaces. Black candles flickered in the darkness. The floor was strewn with various strange objects, from goblets to knives to images of demonic faces and indescribable symbols. On the other wall was a small table, and on it were statues, candles, and other papers filled with symbols. The menacing head statue in the center. The head was described as looking like something straight out of someone's nightmare. The hideous thing was misshapen, perhaps intended to imitate a crude carving into stone. The object had a long, narrow face with large ears. Its mouth hung open, surrounded by a beard and mustache. The unsuspecting couple was absolutely horrified by this. At this point, a physically shaking Kevin desperately pointed to the head and tearfully shouted that he was sure that something evil was living in it and that he could not escape from it. Tom and Christine finally managed to get their traumatized son to retell the story of how he came into possession of the statue. Now they faced a seemingly very real problem that refused to conform to their preconceived belief system, and yet they had to do something if they wanted to save their son. Although they did not attend church regularly, they had friends who helped them get in contact with a minister, John Zaffis, who made his way to the home threatened by demonic forces as quickly as possible. Upon arriving, he was alarmed seeing the changes in Kevin, comparing the current Kevin and the photo of Kevin on the fireplace of the living room. This boy was once happy and lively with sparkling brown eyes and curly hair. He now looked skinny and shrunken. His hair was noticeably dirty and his clothes hung off his thin frame. His eyes grew dull with circles of fatigue beneath them. He took John into his bedroom to show him his cursed chamber. This room contained what John thought were evil manuals of magic. Why are you biting me? She's biting me. among other books on demonology and summoning spirits. There were countless ritual objects around, some of which had occult symbols carved into them. John quickly concluded that the strange statue had obviously been used to conduct summoning rituals in the past and probably had been specially made for this purpose. It was the perfect house for spirits. Kevin had to unconsciously get closer and closer to calling the entity into our world until he finally summoned an extremely powerful creature that was now rapidly making progress in possessing his body. Clearly overcome with fear and regret, he asked John if the spirit would ever leave him. John offered some reassurance, but deep down he thought that the success depended on how long Kevin could endure the competitive spirit for control of his body and soul. Tom and Christine apologized profusely, fearing that they somehow failed their son. John did his best to comfort the fearful family, telling them not to worry. Christine said she saw her son go under after he took the leap to reveal his occult practices to his parents. This going under was clearly a form of trance, which John says often occurs during possession. Christine said Kevin laughed to himself in a low, gravelly voice and said what she could only assume was gibberish. When John asked if it sounded like a foreign language, she nodded, but said it wasn't any language she recognized. Apparently, it sounded like a mixture of Latin and ancient Middle Eastern language. It may have been ancient Sumerian. John correctly pointed out that speaking in tongues was a sign of demonic possession and announced that they must use a deliverance ritual to learn the name of the spirit. According to John, this is similar to an exorcism, but not performed by Catholic clergymen, although they are not very similar. Exorcisms use rituals and very intense practices like seen in movies, while deliverances are slower and use calmer processes that focuses on ongoing treatment to remove the demon. Christine followed John's advice to investigate all possible causes of her son's ailment and took him to a psychiatrist for evaluation. This psychiatrist apparently reassured Kevin that he was mentally healthy, and John said that would benefit Kevin because the mind would have less internal anguish. After a while, John met the family and their chosen minister, who brought a group of volunteers from the church to pray around the house and bless it. These people were placed all over the property, downstairs, the basement, upstairs, and especially Kevin's bedroom. Now it was time to execute the release. Kevin was placed in a hard-backed chair with two church members on either side to hold him down, both to support him and prevent the demon from using his body to lash out. All the other church members in the room began to mutter prayers with their heads bowed and hands on their knees. Other people around the house got to work. Kevin went under. His eyes rolled back into his head, turning a horrible milky white. The temperature in the room had dropped sharply. The minister spoke first, beginning the session with a formal prayer before demanding to know the name of the demonic entity. As suspected, the mischievous boy's face contorted into a manic cackle, and the being inside him spat meaningless nonsense. The minister asked again, only to receive the same answer, followed by the being hissing that the minister was stupid. After several attempts, John realized that they had the name of the entity, but it was completely impossible to pronounce. It was the gibberish that he was saying the entire time. This probably meant that the spirit inhabiting Kevin was a very powerful being and knew that it did not need to reveal itself. If they wanted to use that name against it, they had to utter the gibberish that the disembodied creature was spouting. Of course, it was practically impossible. Instead, the minister simply informed the spirit that it was no longer welcome and must leave the premises immediately. The word seemed to really affect the evil spirit, and Kevin uncontrollably shouted at the priest in a frighteningly altered voice, "No, I will not go. Get out of my sight." The spirit spewed a series of curses and then shouted that it wanted everyone around it to pass before it fell into their nonsensical native language. Unfazed, this happens to them a lot, I suppose. The impromptu congregation began to demand the departure of the spirit from this world. The entity fought it for 2 hours before its human host reached the point of exhaustion. The cold energy in the room suddenly dissipated, and the malevolent presence left with a great whooshing sensation. Kevin sighed and sank into the chair, his eyes fully closed. They all waited a few minutes for Kevin to regain consciousness, and soon realized that the boy had no memory of what had happened since he had been sat in the chair. Examining the head statue, John proudly declared that the spirit had been defeated, noting that its eyes and face now appeared vacant. John knew that spirits sometimes fake an exorcism to sneak in later, and so he warned Kevin and his family to be very careful and forbade Kevin to do any more occult work. Also warning that all the items in Kevin's room should be taken out of the house and cleansed. He gathered everything from the room and loaded them into his car. He told his parents to be on full alert for a very long time. They were told to call him if they noticed anything else unusual or wrong. When John got home, he set up the haunted items outside and prepared to cleanse them. He always did this outside his home, fearing that he could contaminate his house with evil spirits. The objects were treated with sea salt and holy water and prayed over. He also performed a binding ritual on the resin head to prevent the malevolent energy attached to it from jumping to anything or anyone else. After 2 days, he felt safe enough to take the objects into his house, where he performed the same rituals before displaying them in his museum, where they are to this day. The minister continued to perform additional deliverances at Kevin's house, and Christine told John that sometimes she still finds hidden objects in her son's room. Despite this, Kevin afterwards was much better at school and returned to working. John came to the house while Kevin was at school to cleanse the objects in question and add them to his museum. Today, Kevin is in his 30s. Although he is supposed to have returned to his old self, he remains permanently changed on some level. He is still paranoid about the spirit returning and regaining control. John notes that this anxiety is with good reason. Kevin is marked, and the spirits now always know where he is and are waiting to come back into his life when he lets his guard down. Fortunately, this has not happened to Kevin, who continues to contact John. The head is on display at Zappos Museum of the Paranormal, and some visitors say they can feel it watching them when they look at it, and that it makes their skin crawl. It's one of the only things in the museum that still has the power to scare John. Cornelio Closa Jr. first entered what he later described as a terrible dream in September 1951. He was only 13 years old and in 6th grade. He and his friend Rodolfo Carmine were walking home from school one day across a large field when Cornelio suddenly stopped. Slowly he began to point to a seemingly empty spot in front of a nearby brick wall. Rodolfo described Cornelio's eyes as almost bulging out of their sockets. Cornelio said she was beautiful. He was looking at a girl about his age who was dressed in white and had long waist-length blonde hair. Rodolfo was confused and didn't see what his friend was looking at. The girl's bare feet hovered over the grass as she moved gracefully next to Cornelio. Although she never opened her smiling lips, Cornelio later said that he listened to and understood what the strange girl told him. When she touched his hand, he claims he felt different, very light. His awareness of his surroundings faded. To Rodolfo's horror, he seemed to suddenly disappear. It was only a temporary disappearance, and Cornelio said he doesn't remember what happened while he was away with the girl. Finally, he returned home and decided to tell no one about his experience. After his first strange encounter, the unusually gentle Cornelio began to act like an animal. He became moody, angry, and hostile, and now regularly fought with his parents and refused to eat food. His mother said she lost control of him every day, but she gradually got used to his new behavior. But this reluctant acceptance was interrupted one night when he looked particularly flushed and ill. The doors and windows of his house were locked, but Cornelio suddenly disappeared from view, vanished into thin air, right before his mother's eyes. She was horrified. Cornelio later said that the blonde girl appeared to him often, and when he was with her, he felt that somehow he was no longer real, even though everything around him still seemed normal. His teacher began to complain to his parents that he was skipping school, and his father had no choice but to take his son's disappearances seriously, accompanying Cornelio to his walk to school. But even that couldn't stop the strange girl from snatching him out of the classroom. The girl regularly appeared to him at school, reached out, and filled Cornelio's body with a strange sensation before the only thought in his mind that he had to go with her. He had no choice in the matter. His family locked all the doors and windows of the home, but it did nothing. He kept disappearing. When the door was closed, he just walked through it as if it was open. Before hearing the shocked screams of his classmates, he disappeared. Sometimes he disappeared for 3 days without realizing how long he was gone. Cornelio hid things around the house and stole money from his parents. He even jumped on his father in a wild rage and smashed dishes. In desperation, his parents sent him to a state mental hospital and then to a residential care facility, but none of those mental health professionals had a clue of what was going on. The authorities assured his parents that he was a normal boy and said that he would be better off living with his parents, and was sent home. Because they couldn't get an answer to their son's violent behavior, they had no choice but to take the boy to a juvenile correction center. There he was so disruptive that he had to be tied to a bed before he was finally sent home. His parents now lived with a monster instead of their son. There were regular disturbances at school, including beatings. His teacher used to think of him as a quiet boy, but now she saw him as so much of a nuisance that she didn't want him in her class. He would fight anyone at the slightest provocation. Sometimes he could take on 3 or 4 boys much bigger than him who were never able to hold him down. His teacher said that Cornelio seemed to have superhuman strength. A few days after the fight with the 3 boys, Cornelio was called to make a presentation at the blackboard in the front of the classroom. He stood at the board for a few minutes before disappearing into thin air. He was solid, then transparent, then invisible. Cornelio laughed hideously. It sounded as if it didn't come from a human being, let alone a small boy. The whole classroom saw this, and the teacher immediately resigned. Sleep also became impossible for him. He felt his clothes burning when he tried. And then he saw that the girl was asking him to follow him as soon as he opened his eyes. There were many times when he and the girl floated around town together. They went to the cinema several times and visited the international fair that was being held in the city. He never felt tired or hungry when she was with him, and no one else seemed to notice them floating around Manila. They sometimes went to restaurants together and conveniently vanished when it came to pay for food. Sometimes the whole family was in the front room of the house while the children played on the floor as everyone watched Cornelio vanish, leaving behind a foul smell that made the other children cough and vomit. When he disappeared, his parents were stunned by their son's absence, which sometimes lasted 2 days or more. He reappeared in his bed, apparently sleeping soundly, despite the fact that the windows and doors were literally bolted shut at the time. As this chaos unfolded, it was covered in the local media. It wasn't long before religious leaders began to pay attention. An evangelical missionary named Dr. Lester Sumrall became very interested in the case and visited Cornelio's home and spoke with a teacher who had resigned after his disappearance in front of the classroom. She suffered significant mental illness as a result of the incident and never recovered significantly enough to resume teaching. Sumrall also hired police and other investigators to verify the full truth of the matter, and the officers returned to him with sworn affidavits. Reverend H.A. Baker traveled from the United States to the Philippines to investigate the case and contacted Cornelio himself, as well as his parents, his teacher, and his neighbors. He wrote to Sumrall to confirm the belief that the incident was true. Apparently, it had been going on for a year and was getting worse. The Methodist preacher tried to help Sumrall, but said the boy had disappeared right out of his hands. Sumrall decided to perform an exorcism on the child. Cornelio was brought to an evangelical service, after which Sumrall himself prayed for him. Lord Jesus, we plead thy holy blood be free in the name of Jesus Christ. These prayers stopped the haunting. The next time Cornelio saw the young girl, she was transformed into a monstrous creature who seemed to be very angry. After that, the girl disappeared for good.